It's a challenge for me to try to explain what's going on in 60-plus countries in 10 minutes. And given that we are going to talk about one of the major regions, which is one of the causes of global imbalances, and the poorest region in the continent. And if you start looking at either or, there is such an amalgamy, such a diversity of countries that makes very difficult to try to just give a broader picture in about 12 minutes. So with my team, we just deciding what we're going to do. And instead of just bombarding you with graphs, which probably having graphs that will look more abstract paintings than anything because of the amount of countries that we look at, we're going to jump. My idea is just jumping on ideas. I'm going to make certain statements of what do I think these regions for certain specific issues will be in 2030. From there, and how we're going to do that, will work a little bit backwards. We will say that this will happen because certain assumptions happen. I'm going to base my group of assumptions in three major assumptions, and then I'll try to compare the regions and give certain characteristics for each region at the time. We can talk about the crisis. I'll be very happy to talk about the consequences of the crisis too. But I think this is a very short-term issue, and it would be more interesting to talk about different types of issue. Anyway, just to this could look a little bit pessimistic, but what I wanted to just to show here is that, well, the average growth with the Africa and the sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East in the projections that are in 2030, which of course is very difficult to assess, and the situation where we are today. There are big GDP growth differences, but this is not important. There are the two regions that are growing the most. Also, we can see that these big jumps in growth, which need probably to be a little bit adjusted for the last estimates for 2008, are also a reflection of what happened in the world economy during the last years. But what I think is very important is instead of forgetting about the figures, what is important is comparing. We have two regions which will grow, and they will have in 2030 there will be some level of economic growth. But please compare to what will happen in terms of population growth. The difference is abysmal. For certain types of growth rates, the population growth is going to be significantly different. That, of course, will have huge differences from both regions. In terms of Africa, Africa will continue to suffer the terrible problems of struggling with not enough growth to satisfy a growing population. I mean, as we stand today, the Africa population is expected to triple in 20-something years. There are countries like Uganda, where I was looking at it, where the population growth today is nearly 4%. And Uganda, there were some analyses that were saying that Uganda may reach a population of 80 million people by 2050, which is it creates amazing challenges. So the assumption is, what will happen with these countries where they get just strained, by particularly in the case of Africa, or will the Middle East countries suffer because the major source of wealth, which is oil, essentially, will disappear because of the crisis, because of the change to renewable energy? And I'm saying no. The demand for fossil fuels will remain very strong, which has been, again, the source of economic growth in most African countries, and particularly in the Middle East. It will continue to be a reliable source of revenue for exporting countries, and the income for energy exports will continue to fund development and diversification. Because it's also very important to stress that both in Africa and the Middle East, there have been major paradigm shifts in those countries. Those countries, during the last, so to speak, 10 years, and they will continue to do that, they're really thinking on how to manage their wealth that is considered to be finite in order to continue with growing economic wealth. The second assumption that I'm making is that countries will continue to improve macroeconomic management. We cannot think, and there's people that we are traveling all around Africa, we cannot think that the situation, for example, that African countries are facing now is a situation that African countries were facing in the 1970s. Things are very different. Same thing for the Middle East, by the way. Many African countries, they have improved tremendously the economic management. They've been following very orthodox macroeconomic policies and at the same time trying to make an effort in order to promote key sectors of growth. The effort that African countries are trying to make in what we call priority sectors, health and education, is tremendous. I would say that the best example is the case of South Africa, of course, which is also the most developed South African country, where resources since 1994 have been devoted to health and education. Have been tremendous. By the way, I would love to, if somebody is interested, I would love to talk about what have been the consequences for South Africa of those programs. Anyway, there's been also, particularly in the case of Africa, a substantial improvement in the political situation. I'm talking about the 80s and the 70s and what we are now. It is true there are many conflicts. There are a lot of tensions in Africa, where we cannot talk about the situation on where we had these generalized conflicts in the southern part of the continent. For example, we had Angola, we had Namibia, we have South Africa, we have the Congo crisis, as what we compare today. It's true that we have regionalized and very serious potential conflicts, but the situation is much better. What this progress will lead? Well, it will lead to more resources available for growth, probably improve and cheaper access to capital, increased stability, I hope, and leading to higher domestic savings and investment. And they will hopefully, at least partially, an increase in the welfare of population. The third assumption, which is key here, is the role that China and India will play. Doesn't matter which model of growth or which change of paradigm both countries will follow. If China decides to become more or less an export-led economy and decides to develop domestic markets, China will still need to face a situation where the demand for the certain products that Africa and the Middle East produce is going to be high. I just wanted to point it here. The inflection point, that happened in terms of imports and exports from Africa for China and India, which I think this trend, although it may not be that high, but it will attenuate in the next years. But I think it's a trend that will continue. We should not forget, for example, in the case of China, and please correct me, the China experts, there's about 50 million people that are incorporated in urban centers every year. You have to build houses, you have to feed them, you have to heat them. All these type of activities will require a higher demand for commodities. There's a reality check, and then let's talk about less rosy issues and what problems that both regions are facing. First of all, Africa is facing, as the poorest region in the world, but is facing a tremendous bottleneck. We may consider Africa as many people in the development world are talking, as the last frontier. It is clear that the changes in the economic policies, that the years of economic wealth has helped to develop a certain critical mass in terms of domestic markets and so forth. But the problem is that Africa is facing tremendous infrastructure bottlenecks. We are talking about a major continent-wide energy crisis and also a transport infrastructure crisis. Goldman Sachs estimated that in order to Africa to catch up, they will need to Africa should require around 40 billion investments in infrastructures for the next 20 years, which is tremendous. Also, Africa is facing other major issues such as the HIV, which is killing and is making disappear the most productive parts of the population of certain countries, particularly in the southern part of the continent. Countries like, although low populated, like Botswana, the spread is tremendous. I was, for example, I was asked a couple of years ago, Botswana is a fairly developed country. Oh, okay, it's 1 year, okay. Well, anyway, so we have, so I'll have to rush very quickly. We'll have these common challenges that improve capital skills, youth unemployment. You have to, of course, in these regions, you have to improve governance. And for the Middle East, the key issue here is a systemic regional instability that can, even if there's a big need for the resources, can affect the whole economic growth for the next years. I'll go very fast, and I wanted to point out about why this you'll see in this slide, why emerging markets can play a very important role for growth in Africa. It's very funny to stay in the hotel lobbies in Africa. I've been all over the continent, and everybody meets together in the same hotel. There's only one nice hotel, and you start see all over the years more Chinese, Indians, and Brazilians, and less Europeans. And there's people doing a lot more business there, and it's a very interesting effect. Then I'll move to the Middle East. They've been very well. There's a huge potential in the price of oil, which I believe will continue to be high, so that these countries will accaparate very high resources, and that will allow them to play a critical role in terms of developing investment in developing countries as well as in developed countries. How? Through sovereign wealth funds. Sovereign wealth funds can become, and here I'm talking a little bit about the relationship between the Middle East and Africa, but sovereign wealth funds in the next years can become the largest source of investment in African countries, not only in African countries, and we could largely overwhelm. I'm just finishing. The investment made by developed countries in terms of ODA, and that's it. I'll stop here.